welcome to this episode of Chatting with Stacks. I'm your host, Bill Stacks, and today I got Jack O'Halloran.
Hey, Billy.
What's up? How are you, Jack?
Doing the best I can, whatever they'll let me get away with.
I hear you. The man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Jack O'Halloran. So things are really picking up for you, huh?
Yeah, we're getting ready to do a mini series of the book, and got a couple more books we're writing and putting out. And, time to tell the truth about a lot of stuff. And, people are dying to hear that, so we're going to put it out there.
What year did you write your book, Jack?
Wrote it actually. God, let me see. What is this? We're coming to 24 now, right?
Yeah.
I wrote it back in 2013. 2013.
So
been out there for a while. Been out there for a while, and we've just waited for some people to pass away because they didn't want them hassled too much, and because we told a lot of truth in it, and we're about to really tell a lot more truth. And it's really funny because in the book, I tell the truth about the Kennedy assassination. And there's a guy that was a Secret Service guy, and he's writing a book now. And he was on the car behind Kennedy and the back end of that car on the running board. And it's 60 years later, and he finally comes out and says, "Oh, yeah, I heard 3 shots fired." Well, there were 13 shots fired. But for him to say that all of a sudden he remembers 3 shots being fired, because it wasn't a one bullet theory that was blown out of the water years ago. And every 10 years they come up with another deal.
Yeah,
as
one
to what
bullet
happened.
did all this damage, right?
And it's and he was shot. He personally was shot 3 times. The car was shot about 5, 6, 7 times. There was bullet holes in the car. But they took the car right to New Orleans and fixed it before anybody could see it or say anything about it. The whole thing was so covered over. It was amazing. It was one of the tragedies of our history, but it was all boils down to the sins of the father.
You said it's because of his father's the reason why he was killed, right? Like sacrificed his son, basically.
His father, because of his father, the first son was killed, Joe Jr. Then they killed Jack, and then they killed Bobby, and they disgraced Teddy. And it was all because of the actions of his father in the early days of his life in the Prohibition era, and then in the Depression era. He did some things that harmed a lot of people in Europe, financial people, and they never forgave him for it. During the Prohibition era, he was married to Rose Fitzgerald, whose father was Honey Fitzgerald, who was a gangster from Ireland. He came to Boston and made out very well and became a senator, but he controlled all the liquor of Europe, of Scotland and all. So Kennedy went up into Canada with a guy from Newark, New Jersey, who owned Fleischmann's Liquor, and they went into Prohibition, bootlegging. And he was bootlegging a load of booze over into America that was to go to the Purple Gang. There were a bunch of people out of Detroit, Jewish guys who were stone killers. And he sold it to another group for a higher price. And they turned around and said, "Son, you're a dead man." And he ran back home to Boston. And Honey said, "I can't help you with these people. You got to go back to Chicago and sit down and talk to Joe Esposito, who was the first Don of Chicago, and see if you can't sort it out." And Esposito, Joe Kennedy was a brilliant banker. He was a very, very bright guy. And Esposito said, "You go home to Boston, and I'll take care of the Purple Gang. But the fact is, you belong to me now." And he was under thumb to Chicago. And they sent him out to Hollywood. He put together the first distribution deal for RKO Studios, put all the Jewish theater owners together. He got in bed with Randolph Hearst. And then in 1926, he came back. They brought him back to Chicago and sat him down and said they wanted him to do certain things because after World War One, America got into war surplus. We started manufacturing war goods, and we took a lot of jobs away from Europe because we used to import everything from Europe before that. And Europe wasn't getting the return on their money that they invested into the country. They felt that they were being hustled around. So,
and they were, right?
A place in Illinois called the Hamilton Club was a political stronghold. And they sat Kennedy down and they said, we want you to do something for us. And he stole $5 million from Pathé Mutual in broad daylight. No one ever saw it. He was that clever on a stock exchange deal. And they turned around and they said, that's very good. And they liked the way he did it. And they said, now this is what we really want you to do. And he put together a short sell against 30 companies in Europe. And one of the companies belonged to the Rothschilds and was run by Blackjack Bouvier, who was Jackie Kennedy's father. And it bankrupted the company, and Jackie Kennedy's father drank himself to death. And her mother swore vengeance on Joe Kennedy. And she actually groomed Jackie to marry her son, married Joe Kennedy because she wanted her money back. And that was just the start of one part of it. But after the Depression was over, at the end of the day, the government made Joe Kennedy head of the SEC because they had to rewrite all the laws because they knew Europe had to reinvest back into the country, and they wanted to put a new set of restrictions and rules down. And he did a great job doing that in 1935 when he did all that. And they said, he did a terrific job. They made him ambassador to England. And he went over to England. Before he went, some people in Chicago sat him down and said, there's some people over there we want to strengthen the ties with. So when you go see this guy and this guy, And he got in bed with the Shah of Iran, who was a gangster. And he and the Shah of Iran lent money to Hitler. And then Hitler came back to them. They added Khashoggi to the group, and they sold weapons to Hitler. And it was all about making money. And England turned around and said, what do you think you're doing? You're aiding our enemy. And Joe Kennedy said, well, America's not in a war yet, so what am I doing wrong? And they threw him out of England. And no one ever knew why he got thrown out of England. He only came home as Ambassador Joe Kennedy because there was no television then. The radio stations were owned by the Murchison family in Texas. The Gore family owned the papers on the East Coast. They were from Indiana. And Hearst ran the papers from the West Coast. So no one ever printed anything or said why he was thrown out of England. He just came home as Ambassador Joe Kennedy. So he wanted his first son to become president. And he was an ace pilot, a really super kid. And he was 14 days away from being mustered out of the service. And a group out of Europe put together a deal where they had a kamikaze plane. They wanted to fly into the munition factories of Germany to end the war. And they talked Joe Kennedy into test piloting the plane. And the plane blew up and the kid died and the plane died. And that was first son dead. Then he went back to Chicago and he begged Giancana to help him make his son Jack president of the United States. And Meyer Lansky and people in New York said, what are you doing with Kennedy? We already own Nixon. We don't need Joe Kennedy, or we don't need Jack Kennedy. And Joe Kennedy went to Giancana and he said, I promise you both my son's ears. In other words, he had total access to the White House. And then New York said, well, what are you going to do with that clown Bobby, who's already been a pain in the butt? And he said, well, we're going to make him ambassador to Ireland and we'll get him out of the country. So if it wasn't for Giancana, when Jack Kennedy was running for nomination out in California, his father said, well, we have the electoral votes. But after the second day, he came up and he said, well, we're in a bit of a quandary. We don't have all the votes we thought we had. So Illinois and two states next to it turned Democrat overnight. they give him votes for being elected president nomination. And the third day they came back and they said, well, we're still short a little bit. We're having a bit of a struggle here. There was one state that had enough electoral votes to push him across the line, was West Virginia, because West Virginia had a lot of money in it because of the mining and the coal industry and everything. So they went to the Cellini family, who controlled the casinos in West Virginia, and they excused some debt, and West Virginia raised their hand, and Jack Kennedy got nominated. But when the nomination came through in the run for president, H.L. Hunt went out to California and gave Joe Kennedy a suitcase full of money because they wanted Johnson to run as vice president with him.
Yeah.
And now they come down to the election. And the election was very close between him and Nixon. And, you see all the quandary they had over this Trump thing with the votes in the last election. Well, when Kennedy was running for president, there were 4 counties in Illinois that people voted 20 times and they were dead.
Yeah, they were going to graves and having dead people.
Times they voted, and he won by a narrow margin. He won the presidency. So as soon as he won the presidency, his father went to him and he said, "Make your brother Bobby Attorney General." And Jack didn't think anything of that, so he made Bobby Attorney General. And he went to Bobby and he said, "Put all my good friends in jail." And Bobby went after Giancana, who, if it wasn't for Giancana, Jack wouldn't have been president. He went after Giancana, he went after Hoffa, he went after everybody, he went after the whole mafia. That's when that started the spin of the wheel, and it created a lot of animosities and a lot of confusions and stuff. And Jack Kennedy, people never talk about this. That Jack Kennedy wasn't about to live out his presidency. He was dying. He had a disease called Addison's disease, which is a deterioration of the spinal canal. He had syphilis and he had 2 other diseases. They used to shoot him up every day just to keep him walking around with the pain of his spinal canal. And so he wouldn't have lived his presidency out. And his father would rather seen him die the way he died than die from a disease and mark the family. And people could say, well, that's kind of really cold, man, But Look what he did to his daughter Rose. His daughter Rose suffered from ADD and a couple other issues, and he lobotomized her. And she sat in an institution her whole life staring out a window.
Yeah.
Instead of getting medical attentions that could have helped her, he just lobotomized her because he didn't want the embarrassment. So he was kind of a cold-hearted individual. And Bobby was Attorney General. And when Jack was going down to Dallas, 4 people, one of them being Adlai Stevenson, went to him and said, "Do not let your brother go to Dallas. The animosity down there is horrendous, and it's not a good idea." And there's Jack Kennedy driving around in an open car.
Yeah. What are the chances? In a convertible.
Got the Bird Building that all the windows were open. People were walking around with the president below you. And then they had the train station where there was a ramp that went over Dealey Plaza, and guys were walking over that ramp. One of them was Woody Harrelson's father, who was a hitter for New Orleans.
Yeah.
So there were like 30 people there that day that could have assassinated anybody. And there were 13 shots fired. I was there. I saw it. You had Zapruder, who did the film, the Zapruder film. The guy never had a camera in his hands in his life before. And he had to be up really high, so they had him up on a pedestal and 2 women holding his legs because he suffered from vertigo. But he never, with all the gunshots going on, he never took his finger off of the button of that camera. And it ran 28 seconds, and they cut 8 frames of it out. And the film was sold to Life magazine in Chicago for $150,000 before it was ever shot. They already sold it. So the whole plot, the whole thing is so, Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't even in the building. he was a total patsy. There was a prison right across from the Bird Building, and these guys are staring at the window where Oswald was supposed to be with his rifle. And there were 3 guys in the window, 2 dark-complected guys who were Cubans and 1 white guy. And you're talking about a mail-order rifle that you couldn't hit a squirrel with. And if he was shot from that window, it would have hit him in the back of his head and would have blown the front of his head out. You understand? So they fired, and you're talking about a bolt-action rifle. And anybody that knows anything about weapons, you're going to fire 3 shots in 28 seconds with a bolt-action rifle. That's a lot of bullshit. It never happened. With any accuracy at all, forget about it, especially 1,000 feet away. So they, the whole thing was a roost. And Kennedy was shot first from there was a cauldron alongside the street, hit him in the throat. First guy to get shot was Connolly. Connolly got hit in the wrist and the arm. Kennedy got hit in the throat. You see him in the Zapruder film, grab his throat and fall forward. And then he got shot in his lower back, and they never talked about that for 10 years later. And then the driver of the car, Greer, took the last shot and threw his head backwards, and the back of his head came out.
Was it the driver or was it the passenger that?
No, it was the driver.
Oh, it was the driver.
It was Greer. The driver, instead of speeding the car up and getting out of there, he slowed it down to below 11 miles an hour and didn't veer to the left, cut the motorcycle guy off. And he turned and took the last shot. And there's a film out that shows that. It shows the whole Zapruder film. The 8 frames were put in place. And the FBI got the film years later and they figured they better put it out before somebody else put it out, saying that they found it and all this other jazz. So there's a version out that has FBI across it. It shows Greer turn and take the last shot that blew Kennedy's back of his head out. And poor Jackie was trying to get out of the car. They said she was trying to scrape his brains like hell. She was trying to get away. She thought they were going to kill her next. And the Secret Service guys that ran up to the car, they weren't even beside his car during all the fires. As soon as the guns stopped firing, they ran up and they grabbed a hold of Jackie to help her out of the car. And the guy whispered in her ear and said, "If you mention anything about what you just seen, we'll kill your kids." And she never opened her mouth, but she kept a tremendous diary. And her son was going to go to Hollywood to make a film out of his mother's diary. And they killed him. He was taking a plane to Hyannisport, and he was stoned out of his brains. He was with his girlfriend, and he was 3 hours late taking off for the plane. It was a bad storm, and he wasn't qualified to fly a plane instrumentally. And that plane blew up, and he died, and the diary died with him, and it never got to where it was supposed to go.
Did the diary was in the plane when it went down?
Yeah.
Wow.
No one ever saw it again.
What about the patsy that allegedly killed JFK? He ended up getting killed by
patsy? What are you talking
about? By Ruby, right? Jack Ruby ended up killing.
Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald. And Jack Ruby came from Chicago. He was a numbers writer. They sent him to Dallas, Texas. He opened up a restaurant, and he was involved with Cuba. They were running guns back and forth and different stuff. And all the Secret Service guys that were around Kennedy were at his club the night before. They all got envelopes. And Ruby got into that garage with a gun. How the hell are you supposed to do that? You're not supposed to. They were detecting everybody coming in. And when they brought Oswald out, now here's guy Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly shot the president of the United States. When they questioned him, when they locked him up, they found him in a movie theater with a gun in his pocket. And when they took him in and they questioned him, there was not one written note, not one tape of any dialogue, nothing about the interviews with the guy who supposedly shot the president of the United States. And when they brought him out into the garage, the guy who was the captain who was next to him stepped away from him, and Ruby came up and shot him.
So they didn't
And
document the interviews with Lee Harvey Oswald?
say it again.
They didn't document the
They
interviews?
documented nothing. Not one iota. And then when Ruby shot him, and they took Ruby and locked him up, and the Warren Commission went to talk to him, and Ruby said, "You can't talk to me here in Dallas. You got to take me out of here. Talk to me somewhere else. You can't talk to me here." And they said, "Yeah, no, that's bullshit." Blah, 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 blah. And he was in prison. They shot him up with a couple of needles of cancer, and he died. They took the needles from Tulane University Cancer Research Laboratory, which happened to a few people in jail. He wasn't the Lone Ranger. And they shot him up. He was never sick in a day of his life until all of a sudden he dies of cancer.
Yeah. How long did he spend in prison?
6 months.
And
somewhere around there.
He was hailed kind of like a hero, right? Because he allegedly took out the guy who allegedly killed the president.
Well, he killed Lee Harvey Oswald, but they still is murder, So they put him in jail. And when they went to question him, he wouldn't. He said, "You can't talk to me in Dallas. You got to get me out of here." And they said, "No, that's malarkey." Blah, 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 So
Wow.
And he died in jail. So the whole thing, each phase of it, disappeared. You understand? And it took years before the truth started coming out. And every time you turn around, they find this document, they find that document, and they come out with a bit of truth over here. And now Oliver Stone, who did the JFK movie and stuff, he came out with a documentary a few months ago, which shows how the bullets entered Kennedy's body. And it was no way could it be a one bullet theory. It blew the water out of that, which was blown out of the water several times anyway. But Oliver Stone did a whole documentary on it.
That was with the doctors, right?
What?
All the doctors that were involved that day.
All the doctors did the autopsy on him were interns. There were nobody. They covered up the hole in his throat. They said it was from a tracheotomy, which is bullshit. He got shot in the throat. And they also claimed that his brain is in a jar in a museum. Well, how could his brain be in a jar in a museum when it went out the back of his head? It was all over the back of the car. You understand? So there's one fallacy on top of another. Every so many years, more truth comes out. Just like this guy from the Secret Service now who's writing a book and going to make a lot of money on the fact that, well, I was there and I heard 3 shots fired. Well, if you heard 3 shots, you heard them all. You understand? And how come all of a sudden, 60 years later, your memory comes back that you heard 3 shots? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's and he was on the car. He was, I think it was 1 or 2 cars behind Kennedy on the running board. And if you look at the cars behind Kennedy, the Secret Service guys were up on the running board. There was nobody beside Jack Kennedy's car. There was no running boards on it. There was nobody standing beside it. They all had to run up to catch up to the car after the gunshots were over. So you tell me what was planned and what wasn't planned. And then they turn around and they blame the mafia. They blame this guy. They blame that guy. And that's not true. The guy who put together the assassination of Jack Kennedy was a guy called Carlos Sanchez. He was the jackal from Europe. He was probably the premier assassin out of Europe, and he orchestrated the whole Dealey Plaza thing. It took them several months to reroute that thing down Dealey Plaza, and when they went down Dealey Plaza, the wind was so bad that the police couldn't even hear their microphones going back and forth because the wind spiral down there in Dealey Plaza was tremendous.